Something you mentioned, the game. Okay, so like there's a game you have to play with the university. There's also this game that the student has to play with the professor at the university. And Michael Lesh, familiar with him, Kansas State. So he's doing some good research from an anthropological standpoint. And he seems to be suggesting that the formal education system is more of a bothersome rite of passage instead of like the enlightening experience that the institution sells it to you as. Being someone who's trying to champion technology in the classroom and also in a field where some view it's not necessary, can you weigh in his assessment? Like, is that something you see too with your students?
That the assessment that this is a rite of passage rather than an exploration of knowledge.
Yeah, or it's just something. It's something that gets in their way.
Yeah. Well, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think students view it that way. I think part of that is the institution. I think part of that is capitalism.
Okay.
I mean, students say at Wayne State, but not just at Wayne State, at where I was before this, University of Texas, have been kind of taught to view the university almost as a kind of trade school. That like you show up, you pick a major, you slot into that major as soon as you can so you can start working out your requirements. You don't take any courses that don't fit the requirements. And when you get, and so that's the sort of macro level approach to your education. Like, okay, let's sort of figure out what fits where and get out of here in as few credit hours as possible. Then you get into the classroom, and that same sort of calculating approach shows up where it's like, what do I have to do to get an A? Okay, what sort of boxes do I need to check off? And that approach, to me, is not, I mean, I understand it. I understand why students do it. I understand why parents sort of guide their kids to do such things. But if in fact you want someone to just learn a trade or learn a profession, there are better places than a university to do such things. A university should, in my view, allow people to do this sort of exploration that Wes is talking about, this sort of, to get outside of this rite of passage approach, which is like, all right, I'll sit through these courses that don't really matter, I don't really need, et cetera, et cetera. In order to build an education system that values such things, you have to think very differently about education, right? So a philosophy department, or say certain foreign language departments or classics departments that are getting just slashed and cut at various universities. This is happening because we view education in terms of a particular goal. It's harder to justify a philosophy department or a classics department when someone says, how is this going to help someone get a job? Well, I think it will help them get a job, right? But I have to be able to make that argument. But that argument's it's slightly more nuanced than it is for someone who says, oh, I teach engineering classes, and I'll tell you exactly the things I teach they'll have to do on a day-to-day basis in their job, right? I mean, one of my favorite stories about this sort of topic is my brother works in finance for PNC Bank, and he talks a lot about this interview that they did of a kid, I don't remember what school he went to, philosophy major, but also maybe he was like a dual major in philosophy and finance or something, and just nailed the interview. I mean, it was just sort of totally exactly what they wanted, someone who could think and knew how to think. And of course this kid decided, I don't want to be here, and went to graduate school, which may or may not have been the decision I would have advised him about. But I mean, that kind of person, those are the kinds of things we could do if we thought differently about education, philosophy and finance, right? Put those two disciplines together and see what you get. It's so rare to see anyone try to do that, because the kid who wants to get into finance says, all right, well, finance, and if they're going to have a minor, it'll be in international business, or it'll be in economics, or whatever.
Do you see any, so like that rite of passage that exists, and like I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna put my iPod in one ear, and I'm gonna half listen to you as the instructor, and I'm gonna check my Facebook. So do you as an instructor see any way at all of attempting or trying or application to trying to integrate that world into the way you deliver your class, and talk about that, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So then, if in fact then we're trying to get to think about education differently, if we're trying to say get outside of a 19th century rite of passage model, then we could think of these cloud-based technologies as, say, a way. Well, you could think of them as a way to do that, or you could say students are already sort of plugged into say cloud-based computing. How do we, to use a business word, leverage that? Okay. Well, there's a number of ways that I think about this. One is, I'll start a very simple example. On my syllabus, for every class, I have a kind of policy statement that says, if you're going to use a computer in the classroom, I'm cool with that. You can have your computer open. You can be doing just about whatever you want as long as it's somewhat related to what we're doing. However, I do, in that same policy, say just turn phones off and put them away. Now, that's fairly arbitrary, actually becoming a fairly arbitrary distinction, because the phones themselves are computers, and for all I know, they're using their phone to Google something that I just talked about, which is what I hope that they're doing with their laptops. I don't know, and I'm not paranoid enough, and I don't really care enough to walk around and find out what it is they're doing. My hope is that with that computer open, there's the possibility that they'll sort of explore something I mentioned that they don't understand. Some of them I know are taking notes. They're doing all different kinds, and some of them have, Gmail chat up and or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. So for me, that means, I take the good with the bad in that situation. I say, I'm okay with them doing these explorations into outside the space of the classroom, because my hope is that we're getting some good out of it. In certain classes, I've even had students sign up for Twitter accounts if they didn't have them, and almost have a kind of back channel discussion, the possibility of a back channel discussion while we're in the classroom. Now, that's not usually how it worked, because classrooms aren't like conferences, right? You go to a conference, there's a Twitter back channel, there are hashtags for each panel, and people are able to kind of talk amongst themselves while the speaker's talking, which is actually a really useful thing for big conferences. A classroom's a different kind of space. Usually for my classes, they're smaller. There's no reason for someone to send a message across the room, because they could just raise their hand and raise the question to everyone else. But what students have done is post interesting links, say, of things that I mentioned or things that are similar to things that I've mentioned in class, to Twitter with the hashtag that we decide on to use for the class. And then, say, either during or after class, students can sort of check that stream and say, oh, this is that text that Jim was talking about in class, or this is that text that Bob thought was similar to the thing that Jim was talking about in class. All of these things are a way to try to reach outside of the classroom and extend the conversation beyond that classroom. I think that's a great thing. I want that to happen more. The class where I used Twitter the most at the University of Texas, those students, up until and so this was 3 years ago, up until very recently, would sometimes still see something on the web that reminded them of our class, and would post it with that same hashtag on it. Long after they had received their grades for that class, long after some of them had graduated, that conversation was still sort of happening a little bit. And I thought that was fascinating and great. That's exactly what you want. Mm-hmm. That's the exploration that we're talking about. That's something like, now, is that because we use Twitter? I don't think so. I think I like to think it's because it's at least somewhat linked to my pedagogical approach, which suggests that we should be curious about things. That it's not about looking for stuff just because you're writing a paper about it, but about just sort of cultivating a sense of curiosity in which you run across something, you say, this is kind of like what we talked about in class. I'll bet others would be interested in it. Throw it up there.
Now, there are some critics of integrating a cloud mentality education system to formal education, higher education, to either saying it's without offending anyone, it's a University of Phoenix approach where it's, one teacher, 1,000 students, or it's commoditizing, an industry in a sense. But then there are sites out there like Khan Academy, which his original aim was to tutor family members who lived elsewhere, and just kind of grew to this thing where now, literally check it out. There's like a video about almost anything you could ever want to do, and he's trying to help educate things. And So it's like, yes, I can see that one angle of commoditization of an industry, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think you're seeing more of these. And what do you think about things like that? I mean, I know that fear exists, but
I mean, I'm not so much worried about. I don't think I'm worried so much about those kinds of issues. A sort of similar concern I do have, and it's a concern just because I don't know, not because I think it's something we need to fight against, but I don't know how to deal with it. That's just the sort of general push to something like teaching online courses. Okay, that's Wayne and other places are sort of continually saying things like, we would love to have more online course offerings because that's what students are asking for. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, how do you approach online teaching? Do you approach online teaching the same way you would teaching in a traditional classroom? If so, I think you'll fail miserably. But if not, then what is the new pedagogy? How do you build a course in which you never meet face to face? I don't know the answer to that question. I really don't know what I would do if I took some of the classes I taught and just taught them purely as online courses. I mean, I guess you would call the courses I teach now something like a hybrid course, because I have, of course, web pages for everything I do. Students work on stuff online. They submit things electronically. I respond electronically. There's all kinds of online interaction happening, but the general sort of the core of the course happens face to face. Something like Khan Academy or these sort of spaces in which, I mean, I guess I think of those more as continuing education spaces than I do of something like a university, which for me, that's the sort of exciting thing about something like that, is that something that this country doesn't do very well is continuing education, right? We don't have and I'm not sure that maybe there aren't countries out there that do, but what would be nice is if we had a kind of ethic or infrastructure by which people could continue their education well beyond graduate school, right? Say you enter the workforce, you're 35, 40 years old, but you become interested in something. Well, how do you cultivate that interest? Well, you could go to a local university, you could go to a community college, you could see if your employer is willing to pay for some courses to get some sort of graduate degree. There's all kinds of ways you can do that, but we're not really set up for it, right? It's not something that most professions encourage or push people towards, and if they do, it's sort of superficial. I know when I worked at MCI, they said, if you're interested, go take a class and we'll pay for it, but it was like,
there's a lot on the end of that. We'll pay for it, but you have to stay here for 18 months afterwards or pay us back.
Right, exactly. Class. We want you to do this so that you'll have more value to us, right? So I want you to do that so that you'll be able to teach others how to do it.
Right.
But then if something like Khan Academy or all of these spaces in which you can sort of continue to learn outside the space of a university, or outside the space of any sort of traditional educational setup, to me that's really exciting. That's exactly the kind of thing we should be looking for. And it enables that kind of tinkering ethic of like, I'm curious about this. I find a video that kind of begins to explain it. Even if it's something, what if it's calculus? What if someone just says like, wow, I didn't know I was a math person. I was told in 6th grade that I wasn't a math person. I was a English or history person. I wasn't tracked into the advanced math classes. Now I'm finding that I'm pretty good at this, maybe, or at least I'm interested in it. How do I do that? Well, there's spaces online where you can sort of begin to think about these things.